Okay, it looks like we have most people at this point. So we'll just go ahead and get started. All right, so for just beginning with some housekeeping items, all observers are going to be in listen only mode, but you will have the availability to put in questions. All workgroup members are going to be actively participating throughout this meeting, and you can use the raise hand function. We will also follow up via email to any observers that might have put questions in the Q&A box that have not been able to be addressed during the workgroup meeting. And then all slides and recordings of the presentation will be posted online on the protocol development webpage. I do want to note that we do plan on moving the protocol development page from under the industrial tab to the waste and methane destruction sector tabs. So some of the links, if you have some previous links, might be broken, but it was just because it'll be moved. So I plan on doing that shortly after the workgroup meeting. As I shared via email with you all, moving forward, I'll be taking over as a primary contact and leading the development of this protocol. And then I'm joined by my colleague, John Remicall, who's the director of protocol development, who will provide technical oversight in the development process. So it was just following some recent organizational structure changes where Mackenzie and Jordan have been transitioned off the project. So you can direct all feedback, comments, and questions to myself and John. And before we get started, I'll just give John a chance to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm really happy to be a part of this effort and working with Rachel and you all to develop this protocol. Looking forward to today's discussion and the rest of the discussions. Just by way of background, uh, my focus has largely been on the nature-based side of things, but I have worked on a handful of our other protocols at the reserve and other sectors. So looking forward to really diving into this one and helping get this through to the finish line. So I will leave it there. Pass it back to you, Rachel. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Most of you have been able to join the workgroup meetings already, but Jason is new to the workgroup meetings. This will be his first one in attendance, so I'll give you a chance, Jason, to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Jason Sineker. I am an independent consultant working on behalf of Spark Renewables and Red Clay Renewables, both in the plugging of orphaned and abandoned wells. We also do landfill gas projects. I've been in the space for about a year and a half. I'm a mechanical engineer by degree. We have been underway with an ACR project that is, I'll just leave it at that. And then we look forward to developing this with you guys. And Dan, good to see you again. We'll talk soon.
Thanks for joining, Jason. And then just wanting to give a revised timeline and development process update. So we're in our third work group meeting, aiming to wrap up our discussions on eligibility, at least for the time being. And then with the next two work group meetings going on to the GHG assessment boundary, quant, and the monitoring for the next two meetings. So please provide comments on eligibility by the end of next week, which would be February 27th. There will be a chance to provide more comments on eligibility, but this will allow us to see what conversations still need to be had and what further revisions need to be made to the draft protocol. And before the next two workgroup meetings, we plan on sharing some information on the next sections to support our conversations like we did for this week. And with the recent changes in the additional workgroup meetings, our revised protocol development timeline has us put for public comment period sometime in April and May, and then aiming for that June 2026 board meeting. And then again, all of this will be reevaluated as needed if we need more workgroup meetings or more time to discuss more.
So Rachel, I have some comments not about eligibility, but about the protocol where we're at now. can we talk about that today, or is that something that is better afterwards in talking about eligibility? Or can I at least bring those up to let the group know?
So I guess I can provide you with an overview of kind of how we're gonna handle today. So before the work group meeting, I had sent you all some supporting information as well as
Mhm.
like the beginning stages for the draft protocol with
Mhm.
some of the changes based on our conversations. So my plan for today is to kind of cover those conversations, summarize what decisions have been made or what proposals have been put forward, as well as some of the other considerations that we plan on or that have been brought up that we haven't had as much of a chance to discuss or haven't really had the consensus on yet. And then from there is to move into quant. So I guess was there anything like specifics from what was proposed? Because we might, be covering it later.
So is it okay with you if I just kind of put out those few things that I had questions about or concerns about?
Sure. Yeah.
So um, within what we have here, there's things like with the professional engineering company that it notes in there that they should have 100 clients within the last year. And I think that's ridiculous. And that has nothing to do with experience, qualifications, or um, ability. So yes, so that would, one, it could rule out a smaller company that might do good things, but does nothing about quality or anything like that. So there's a lot of companies that do lots of clients that you would not even want doing this. So that gives me concern. It says we have to have this professional engineering company, but it doesn't note that the documents and the reserve analysis needs to be signed off by a registered professional engineer in that state, which I think should be a requirement. So if you're going to be practicing engineering, you need to be a registered professional engineer, and you should be a registered professional engineer in the state that you're practicing in. That's why I'm a registered PE in 36 states. We do work for the SEC for all this stuff, and it's quality and qualifications as opposed to number of clients. Is that's my position. The other thing that we note in here when we talk about reserves and all that, and I don't want to get on the bad side of Reed or Jason or anything, but there's a lot of stuff with reserve analysis that looks at one thing, so it's going to maybe look at production or whatever, but we don't dig into the details. Although we provide different potential reserve analysis, um, there's a lot of stuff. Like right now, there's almost a conventional oil and gas resource. I don't want to call it a boom, but a lot of people that are going in, and like we're doing an AAPG meeting next week here in Tulsa on revitalizing legacy legacy projects and so forth, where you're going in and taking some of these marginal well projects that some people may just write off and say, oh, they're done. But you can go in and redevelop those with new technology, with horizontal drilling, with all these things that have that. So one, you could look at that, say some of these marginal wells may not just be these reserves may not be done, but on the other hand, in the approach that we're saying, if you do that, you may be vastly underestimating the actual reserves that could be done if we're using, new technology. So I'm not sure which way to go on that, but those are kind of uh, my few comments. So just I'm trying to make sure that we're being, you know, that we've got that if we're going to say, you have to have somebody doing these analysis, they need to not only have a number of clients, they need to like have, a PE. They need to show that they're experiencing that, and that we're looking at these other things that a lot of people have been ignoring with the technology coming on that could increase the number of credits that are generated. But it's and I know it's complex, but those are my comments. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I will say that we do touch on some of those topics or like the points that you bring up later in the presentation. So I think that we can have those discussions there. And also to your comments, I guess specifically about the qualifications for the engineering firm, we don't dig into the details during this worker meeting specifically, but please do submit those comments written, and then to whatever extent that we need to have a larger work group conversation, digging into what those qualifications look like, we definitely can have that conversation. Reed, is there anything you wanted to say now, or kind of wait until we get to that point in the conversation?
Yeah, just one quick thought. We can talk about the independence of petroleum engineers, and this is a complicated topic with a bunch of different things to dive into. There's going to be a huge amount of time for written comment that goes in heavy depth on all of these subjects.
Yeah.
We're through 2 meetings. We've moved back 2 months. I we've got to keep a pace to stick to like the things that Rachel wants to cover on each individual meeting and kind of not comment on anything outside of that. I'm not the police on this. This is up to Climate Action Reserve, but methodology development typically takes a really, really long period of time. And so would love it if we can like try to be super fast in continuing our process here in order to stick to a June timeline. As a lot of people's businesses depend on trying to get a methodology done on Climate Action Reserve and get things going on projects.
But we want to have a good methodology too, though, Reed. So
For sure.
sorry.
And we will. So we're going to have, the conversation that we're having during these work group meetings isn't necessarily the end of the conversation. So please provide those written comments, and then there's always a chance for us to revisit anything that we haven't resolved at the end. Even if we move on to the assessment boundary and quantification next meeting, it doesn't mean that this is the end of eligibility. So we will continue to have these conversations as necessary and make any edits to what we have already proposed to make sure that we do address all of your considerations or any concerns you have, as well as, other concerns brought up by the rest of the work group. So while we are trying to be efficient, it doesn't mean that we are going to bypass the necessary conversations that we have to have. So today, I'll really be focusing on presenting an overview of the conversations and decisions that we've come to so far. But I'll be changing a little bit of the way that we're presenting the topics. So rather than clear sections, just kind of taking that step back. And then I'll also add some specific questions to facilitate the discussions. Again, it's not the end of the considerations that need to be addressed. There's written comments available to address those as well. So we'll be covering eligibility and the assessment boundary for how the marginal wells are being defined, and then the ownership structure for these projects and the resulting owner of the emission reductions, and then the performance standard test. So what reserves are eligible, who does the analysis, how the analysis is done, and then the required timelines between the steps of a project. And just generally, we'll be presenting the proposal for the project start date, and then end with a description of all the dates and milestones with the project, and present like a general overview of how these each steps kind of relate to one another. And then we'll finish with the normal next steps. So into eligibility and assessment boundary. So on the left, I provide a graphic where the dark blue is the eligible, and then gray is ineligible, and then the light blue is some criteria for defining a marginal well. And then on the left, I have the dark blue text, the blue text, which is the proposal, and then some red text for some of the remaining considerations. So following our last work group meeting, we decided to take a step back, kind of present the broader picture, and then narrow it down from there. So within the given reservoir, there's two types of wells, unconventional wells not being eligible, but then narrowing down what type of conventional wells are eligible. So active wells, which are the ones that are contributing the most to consumption, are not going to be eligible. Idle wells that are not actively producing, and then orphaned and abandoned wells are not eligible. And then only marginally producing wells would be eligible. And then we're defining it related to specified criteria. Each criteria is going to have its own definition, and we'll be covering those within the performance standard test. So some of the details with those are not necessarily on this slide, but we do kind of get down to how we're going to standardize that criteria for the project definition. So first of which is that the well needs to be past its terminal decline. And at that point, future production is predictable. So that improves our ability to quantify the avoided emissions. It must also be actively producing, and that it can demonstrate consistent production over the previous 12 months from the project start date. And within our conversations, linking production to a US government definition like the DOE or IRS has said to be likely to exclude otherwise additional wells under the protocol. So in that case, we can either define actively producing in other ways, so not having a specific production rate, or it can be tied to a sufficiently high enough production rate, like the proposal for 75 barrels of equivalent per day, as to not exclude wells that would otherwise meet these other additionality criteria. But within that, it would have to be large enough to exclude, or it would have to be sufficient to exclude the large producers, but also exclude those idle wells. And then it should also be not yet orphaned and abandoned. So that can be demonstrated through defining what's actively producing, but also through ownership. And also if there is a government classification for idled or orphaned and abandoned wells. So for instance, like that is present for mines in the US. So coal and trona mines are classified by the Mine Safety and Health Administration. So they'll actually classify mines as being abandoned. So we plan on making a proposal on the solution for these two considerations in the coming weeks. And we have talked about this at length. However, I do want to pause for any comments at this time. And we do have the option for written comments, or other comments might also be addressed in later slides when we start kind of defining what the performance standard test looks like. Yes, Dan.
So everything you have in there is pretty standard from a general, I would say, regulatory standpoint. And that's what a lot of the state oil and gas agencies are pushing. But when you look at those data, what we find in some cases is you may have fields that are producing low volumes, but other wells around them are producing much higher volumes because they've had things done. And I just like part of what I look at when we call just like looking at decline curve analysis isn't everything. I mean, there's fields that are, going in and being dramatically redeveloped with significantly more production. But if we look at just this one thing, we're lowering the standard. So my only thing in this is to be able to say, you got that, but do you want to look at what is potential, what is there, what is in the area, what else do the wells have? Because I'm just wanting to make sure that we consider that state oil and gas agencies also have a responsibility to manage the state's best interests in reserves and so forth. So, once you plug that well, you maybe can't afford or economically, go reproduce or, start accessing reserves that would be potential. And in many oil and gas fields and reservoirs, there's a lot of things that go on, but like if you look at the Glencoe oil field, the total reserves that have been recovered out of the entire field is about 11%. So do we do reserve analysis and decline analysis on one thing, or do we look at everything, or do we look at the potential of wells that maybe have stacked pay? If you look at the Texas Panhandle, where you only could get leases on gas leases and not oil leases, so there's multiple zones that have never been produced. So do we include those? Do we just ignore those? I mean, it just my only point here is that it seems more complicated than we're giving this, and I'm not sure just how the best way to handle it. So anyway, just throwing my comments out.
No, thank you for those comments. I think, yeah, part of it is wanting to simplify it to the extent that I can to present the case for the protocol, but also, yeah, definitely acknowledge that it's a lot more complicated than this. But um I do have an extra slide kind of talking about what the assessment boundary, like how wide we can, how for wide we want to go. But I'll pause there. Yeah, Arjun, you're on mute.
Just a brief comment, having spent a long time dealing, I was at ACR for a few years and such. It's and in the carbon markets for many years, it's the whole challenge of figuring out what the right counterfactual scenario is that and that will be widely seen as credible. Um, the note, I'm sure you're right, Dan, that there are many things that can be done to redevelop certain fields to produce a lot more product, a lot more oil and gas. The challenge is sort of that hypothetical question of whether such and such thing would have actually happened. And that's where one has to be, I think, cautious in making assumptions about things that could be done, because the criticisms will be that such and such thing may not have actually happened, transpired, been done, or, and so one has to sort of be more cautious about the assumptions around the counterfactual.
Mhm. Any other immediate reactions to this? Otherwise, I have some considerations. Okay. So in a previous meeting, a consideration was raised that plugging a well may result in unintended emissions from outside the pond or the project boundary. So secondary effects when a producer or when an operator plugs a well or multiple wells in order to increase pressure within the reservoir and allows for increased production at another well. And this one has been observed in Texas, for example. So can the protocol include a qualitative safeguard or some type of quantitative, like leakage deduction, and so that we can address these situations? So, one option that we are proposing here is if it's a possibility to require all wells within a given distance or wells drilled to the same depth to be plugged. Um, and we say distance or depth, depending on what the major factor here would be in order to increase pressure at a nearby well. And then we also acknowledge that this would require, multiple or maybe multiple owners to work together, if not all the wells within a given distance are owned by, yeah, if multiple wells are owned by different entities, they'd have to work together if that's a requirement within the protocol. Um, Another option would be which could be done in combination with option one, is the project developer would demonstrate that the risk is minimal. So the protocol would standardize how they would determine and demonstrate that the risk is minimal. So could they, if it is tied to a depth or a distance component, can they demonstrate that there's no wells within that distance that would cause that risk? Or also, if there is a quantitative leakage deduction, that would be the most appropriate step. We don't necessarily need to get into the specifics on how the qualitative or the quantitative deduction would be applied, since we do have conversations related to that in the quant section. But to just get a better understanding of which direction makes sense, if that risk is significant. Otherwise, if there's any other recommendations on how to address these secondary effects, or general comments of if it's not that high of a risk. Yeah, Reed.
The current draft protocol, I don't believe, dismisses this risk. I think it requires a professional petroleum engineering firm to evaluate reservoir communication and applies a permanence and uncertainty discount where appropriate. It also includes annual monitoring and provides for adjustments if reserves are accessed later. A mandatory co-plugging requirement based on distance or depth may appear conservative, but it would not account for geologic variation or ownership realities. The draft protocol instead manages risk through a structured technical and qualitative review and discounting, which I think is consistent with other climate action reserve protocols, particularly forestry, which address leakage and reversal risk. We don't have blanket prohibitions in there, but through that risk assessment and buffer style mechanisms, there are opportunities for, I guess, mitigating any reservoir communication. But again, we just use a discount in the current methodology, which I think it still matches other CAR methodologies in how thorough they look at permanence.
Okay. Yeah, Heather.
Maybe this is a question for Reed. Well, I'll, I guess, first state that I think we would be supportive of a third-party engineering report that assesses permanence and communication, Reed, like you were mentioning, as a way to demonstrate low to zero horizontal leakage on a project by project basis. And so are you saying that there's a horizontal leakage deduction for all projects, or is it on a project by project risk assessment based on the results of a third party engineering report?
Currently, the petroleum engineer would take a look at all the wells being plugged and examine any other wells that are going to produce or that could produce the reserves we'd attribute to those wells, and then apply a discount based on a matrix that is both likelihood of reservoir communication and quality of data. And so it comes out to 10, or I think the max discount is 20%. Anything that is reviewed to have a greater than 20% likelihood of reservoir communication is not eligible for a project. So that's the way the methodology currently works. It works into how much we need to discount for the basis of reservoir communication. Again, this is just proved developed producing reserves, not all potential reserves that could be produced there.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so it sounds like it's kind of it makes sense to do both the qualitative and quantitative, where the qualitative assessment results in, yeah, the quantitative deduction. Any other initial comments? Otherwise, sounds like we'll be revisiting this in a future discussion then. Okay. So there was also interest in multiple wells being plugged at the same time and what that eligibility would look like under the protocol. So there may be an interest where owners that operate multiple wells want to plug several wells and to reduce the administrative burden, for instance, could they include all multiple wells within one project ID? So because eligibility, start date, and the emission reductions would all be assessed on a well level, the question is, should the protocol allow for multiple wells under one project ID? So given the risk of secondary effects that we discussed on the previous slide, it sounds like we won't necessarily be going down the route of requiring multiple wells to be plugged at the same time, rather going down that analysis of the reservoir communication. Then should we allow for the option for projects to like multiple wells to be reported under one project? So if yes, then we would want to include some limitations and limitations that, we wouldn't want to see wells on the opposite side of the country from being reported in one project. So we're proposing some conditions here, like, required the same ownership. Should there be a requirement that they're in that same reservoir, or should it just be at the state level? Should there be a time component, like requiring all wells to be plugged within a certain time frame from each other? Or should there really just only be one well per project? Since the analysis would be done project by project, the aggregation and the simplification might not be a benefit for having all projects be or all wells being assessed on the same ID. But it could simplify some of the administrative steps, like submitting the project for a listing and having our review, only having one project within our registry platform, things like that. But is there any thoughts on the conditions or whether we should only allow one? Yeah, Reed. You're still muted.
Sorry. I think the draft protocol requires the same owner, requires that the wells are all plugged within a certain time frame. Maybe that's 12 months, might be 24 months, whatever you all decide at Climate Action Reserve. Same reservoir and same state. But I think that that would naturally limit projects to a certain set of wells that would run the same level of reservoir communication analysis.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? I mean, yeah, it seems doable, especially having the same ownership makes sense. And then we'll just have to think a little bit about, yeah, how the start date, because each well would have its own start date and its own crediting period. So trying to see, how that would make sense in terms of, yeah, application. But any other comments there?
I think that makes sense to be able to include multiple wells under the same project, given the restrictions that Reed outlined. The only concern is with the communication. Whereas if you had multiple wells under one project, but then a separate well that was in communication within the same basin would either have to be plugged or, they would have to show reasonable non-communication.
Mm-hmm.
Grenade, I think the current draft protocol has every single well examined for reservoir communication. So each well is, if for instance you look at a project, you're going to plug 10 wells, and there are 2 wells that are going to receive those reserves,
Mhm.
the project developer would be incentivized to get those wells plugged too, because then the overall permanence of the project goes up.
Mhm.
Jay? You muted.
Originally brought the issue up relative to of multiple wells relative to verification, and I would just ask. I mean, I'm not opposed to having multiple wells in a project. I think there just needs to be good guidelines in terms of what the expectations are for a verifier relative to multiple wells. Things like site visits, sampling, those types of things. Are is again, I bet basically what I heard you say is that each well would be its own, even though it would be listed under one project, it would require its own verification, which again I think just needs to be very clearly communicated so we don't get into some type of sampling of, if there's 20 wells in a project, that the verification would only look at a sample unless that's what the registry's expectation is.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We'll definitely consider providing, sufficient guidelines for verification, and we do in Section 8 of all of our protocols include some um, guidelines for verification bodies. So we'll definitely make sure. Yeah, Dan?
So I'm curious, and I know, Reed, where at least I've seen you active, but what do you do in states like Texas for, say, a gas lease where you're for gas wells, you're providing production to the state on a lease basis and not a well by well basis? Or what do you do if you're in Appalachia and conventional wells only report production annually? So the data that you get can be very sparse. So do we try to account for that in what we're doing here, or do we just say you've got to provide monthly data? You have to provide, I mean, what? I'm just curious how you handle some, because all the states are very different in how they handle production reporting and what's available. You can't just go on Enverus and go, here's what it is, and I'll use that because it may not be accurate per the well. It may just be, divided out. So I'm just curious.
I think the draft methodology says that if per well production and reserves cannot be established, then it cannot be eligible for a project. So in a state in which public production is allocated, you'd have to get a petroleum engineer to consult on individual production reserves from each individual well, which does mean it'll limit scope, certainly, to
So
certain places where you can't get individual well results.
So Texas and Appalachia are out.
Absolutely not. You can get individual production and reserves in both Texas but it's not public. So like Enverus will publish allocated production, but you can get individual production per well.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so sounds like multiple wells is okay, but with, the same owner, the same reservoir, and then sufficient guidance for verification bodies related to site visit, sampling, and, providing sufficient guidance there. Okay. So on an almost similar to some of the conversations that we've already been having, um, after a well is plugged, there is a risk of leakage of if a new entity or the same entity ends up drilling a new well to access the reserves that have been credited. So wanting to build out some quantitative safeguards related to that risk. So for instance, like we're proposing some options here based on our conversations. So, like the verification body would confirm that there's new wells that haven't been drilled from the previous verification. And if a new well has been drilled, then the project isn't eligible for future crediting. I guess based on our conversation from previous slide, where the third party does the reservoir communication and incorporates that quantitative deduction, would that be sufficient to accommodate for some of this risk? Or, oops, sorry about that. Um, or, you know, so I guess option two gets at that the communication or the reservoir communication. And then there was a brief conversation last work group meeting about requiring retirement of the mineral rights, which would involve a conservation easement in place. However, that would be very difficult and probably unlikely, which is why we have it grayed out here as being an option that was on the table, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily the best approach, although we can include it in the protocol if they're able to demonstrate that they were able to do that. And of course, that would require buy-in from consent and approval from the mineral rights owners. Um, any initial reactions here? Do you believe that, site visit requirements would essentially address some of this risk, or at least catch the risk and prevent for eligibility, or the qualitative deduction, or the quantitative deduction based on that qualitative assessment of risk communication, would like that be sufficient? Dan?
Why don't you let Reed go first?
Sure.
I think the draft protocol, well, first, if an operator is willing to plug a field early, it does limit the amount of economics remaining in that field. So the incentive to re-drill into shallow PDP reserves that were largely depleted is very low. But the draft protocol requires an annual review of all state, public, and private databases and establishes an adjustment deposit account that functions similarly to a buffer pool. So if new development were to access previously credited reserves, credits would be drawn from that account. But because credits are issued ex post and at least annually, credits would simply cease if that development occurred. That structure, again, closely mirrors a lot of the other CAR methodologies that are out there. The draft protocol has a walkthrough developed by Netherland and Sewell on how to take a look at any new development permits or new wells and assess whether they would threaten the reserves. So hopefully it is a fairly black and white walkthrough of any new well proposal.
Then what I would add to this is I would say I like what Reed is saying here, but just keep in mind where Reed is saying that individual well data is available. So in a lot of areas, especially with gas, you might have 10 wells or 20 wells or whatever, and they go to a central facility and they do maybe annual production tests and they allocate. So the actual individual well production is not available per se unless you're doing tests. But this gets real tricky, and looking at what's there and making statements of the likelihood is low, and it has historically been low, but the technology advances have increased, and I'm just wanting to make sure that we have enough limits on what's what we're proposing, so that we're staying ahead of the game here. And I think Reed's got a good handle on that. We should be, he's been through this with ICR and all that, so let's look at that. But there's still this is still very complex, and I want to make sure we're not ignoring that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Wes?
The only other thing, this might be particular in the Illinois basin, but we have coal bed methane wells, so I'm assuming this would also apply to coal mines that are taken out. Yeah, you go and you plug your coal bed methane wells, then the coal mine comes through and mines through the coal. There's not new gas wells, but the active mine has come into the area, and I think that would be something, it might be too minor to even include, but it's another area where you could have mineral extraction rather than maybe wells drilled. Maybe that would cover both, and that's just nitpicking language. But that was just something I thought I'd bring to your attention.
But if you're
Okay.
doing coal bed methane, and so that you got to dewater to get the methane out, so is that really, do those wells
Never had to
ever
dewater.
really qualify?
I've never had to dewater.
So you just drill into the coal and they produce down there.
Yeah.
Okay, so sounds like what I'm hearing is there's, the database that they can pull from to confirm that there's no new wells within the reservoir to access or that would raise the um, secondary effects concerns. We can include some guidance related to that and for the verification bodies. Any other comments related to this? Okay. So this is one of the final considerations for eligibility for the sense of like how we're defining the well that we have for this work group meeting. Again, not the final consideration that can be brought forward. But so all of our protocols are designed to ensure that the project does not give rise to social harm. So, for instance, like projects may be located on tribal land. So, how should the protocol include or ensure tribal sovereignty? So, for example, the California Compliance Program does this by requiring a waiver of tribal sovereignty for those projects. There's also an added consideration for the surface and the mineral rights that are often passed down within families and across generations. So should there be safeguards around their interests, for instance, like or any other general notification requirements? So, for instance, within our Latin America protocols, like Dominican Republic and Argentina livestock protocols. We require that if a third party is going to operate the project on behalf of a livestock owner, they have to provide information on the carbon market, how it works, estimated emission reductions, expected revenue, and just general requirements of the protocol. So then from that, then the livestock owner would then agree to the project and all information would be provided to us. So that's just like an example of how we've added some social safeguards into our protocols. But is there any social safeguards that we should be requiring within the protocol, maybe as I've proposed them here, or other considerations that I haven't raised, um, or any other general comments related to safeguards? Yes, Reed.
My top line here is that we're not causing a new activity. We're just causing that same activity earlier. So to put additional things that the carbon credit methodology needs to tell an operator of wells to do beyond what they would traditionally do, I think actually places maybe a little bit more risk here. So I would tend to have the operator do their normal course of business, and that might involve tribal sovereignty. It might involve communication with the surface and mineral owner, whatever the case may be. But have their normal course of business, just do it earlier, receiving incentives through the carbon market.
Okay. Anybody else have any initial comments related to this? Okay. Great. Now moving into ownership of the emission reduction. So basically, we decided to, reframe the conversation a little bit from the last time that we talked about this. So before we had proposed or we had presented, who can act as the project developer. But with this discussion, we really wanted to focus on like who has rights to the emission reductions that they then could, allow for a third party to come in and, there is that transferring ownership. But we wanted to essentially outline the general ownership of how wells can typically operate and the transfer of ownership within that, just to make sure that we have a foundation here and we're laying the groundwork. So there's essentially like three broader groups that are involved to some extent. So there's a surface estate who we grade out here because they would have like essentially, to my understanding, the least claim out of the parties that would be involved. And then you have the marginal well operator, and then you have the mineral estate. So and then I also outlined some steps between the transfer of ownership. So the surface estate would have the land rights, the mineral estate would have the rights to the hydrocarbons, so the oil and the gas. And then the well owner would have an agreement with the surface estate that would transfer land rights to the well operator. The mineral estate would enter an agreement with the well operator to allow them to extract the hydrocarbons. So when the hydrocarbons are extracted, the emissions associated with that process would then be owned by the well operator during the baseline. So to our understanding, then that would make the well operator the default owner of the emission reductions. Then they can transfer the ownership of the emission reductions to another entity to operate the project. However, we did want to confirm that so whenever a well is plugged, the lease ends, and then the hydrocarbons are then transferred back to the mineral estate where the well operator is no longer going to be extracting. So we wanted to confirm that the plugging and the ending of the lease would not impact the well operator's ability to claim the emission reductions. So with this protocol, we are, the project activity is plugging the well early and not extracting those hydrocarbons. So the emission reductions would then, in a normal business as usual scenario, be attributed to the well operator. So that is how we're understanding ownership. So essentially, the default owner of the emission reductions would be the well operator, unless they transfer the rights to another entity to operate the project. Yes, go ahead, Martin.
I guess I'm just going to sort of raise some questions to help because I don't know the answers to these, but some people on the call may know, and that's sort of about the obligations that an operator has to the mineral rights owner from which they've leased the rights to continue production and royalty payments or whatever, and whether that's something that we need to be concerned about here with respect to this protocol, as far as proof of agreements that the mineral rights owner has consented to this, possibly that the mineral rights owner has signed that they do not make claim to any of the carbon offsets, things like that. I don't know if those are matters that we need to sort of think about in this group, but I think it's maybe relevant to this part of the discussion.
Yes, definitely relevant to the discussion. Reed, do you have any initial comments related to that?
My understanding is that the lease agreement with mineral and surface owners requires the operator to act as a reasonably prudent operator. That does not mean maximize production to all extents, but it is one reason why marginal wells are the only thing that applies here. Typically, the highest amount of emissions to lowest amount of production. The royalty checks can be very small for a lot of these. The way I see this is there's generally two options. One is that the emission reduction and all carbon credit revenues go to the party who paid to shut down the well. That is typically going to be the operator, the one who financed the emission reduction activity. The other could be that the emission reductions and carbon credits follow the division order, being paid out in percentage to both the operator and the working interest owners and mineral owners. Probably going to lean on Heather here to maybe take a look at this CRC and see how you see it. But my thought has been that the general producers 88 lease does not require somebody to produce every single barrel that's in the ground, but instead to act reasonably prudent and given the high emission, low production, low royalty payments, the operator has the discretion to plug the well when they see fit.
Wes, I saw that you had raised your hand at one point. Did you want to?
Yeah, nothing. Going just off what Reed said, that's exactly how I see it too. And I was just going to tell you to really lean into the business as usual aspect of this because you're going to have outliers. There's going to be certain leases that say, and I've seen them, where they try to get some kind of leverage or ownership more than is typical. And you'll see that. You'll see it with joint operating agreements where the lease owner, the person who owns the lease, has hired someone else to operate their wells. And they may be entitled to a percentage of that, but leaving it to the operator, that's their agreement as to who gets what when it comes to this. And that's, you're not gonna be able to solve all those in the protocol.
Mhm.
That was my only comment.
That is a good point, Wes. All revenues would have to go to the operator first, no matter what. Whether it's supposed to go to the royalty owners or go to the working interest owners, it's all going to flow through the operator no matter what. So I don't think the carbon credit methodology should try to state where it should go outside of to the party who owns the well. And then it's up to them to make that decision on where it's supposed to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And if the if the well owner were to, yeah, then hire somebody else to operate things day to day, then there can be an evaluation of what those contracts look like. And that's even where, we can step in to support any questions that arise during like verification or project developers want to ask, questions, and we can answer those project specific questions when they arise too. Great. Great. And then from there, we're going to move into the performance standard test. So there's a couple different components under the performance standard test. And I'm just trying to outline here so you can have a sense of what the flow of the rest of this section is going to look like. But basically, what economic reserves are being credited. So what are the P1, P2, and P3 reserves and which ones are eligible? Who is assessing the reserves? So that's the engineering firm that we have talked about and what their qualifications are, how it's being assessed, so that assessment method to determine what the economic reserves are, and then discussing the economic limit to demonstrate that the project is still economically viable as of the start date. But we'll get into what those some specifics. So we had touched a little bit about this on our previous work group meeting, but wanting to revisit that and just outline our proposal. So I pulled these three definitions using the Petroleum Resources Management System. So we're proposing using only crediting the proved reserves, which are the P1 reserves, which would be the quantity of oil and gas that has a 90% probability of being recovered. And then we're recommending not crediting P2 reserves, which would be better than 50% probable, or P3 reserves, which would be less than 50% but above 10% probable. Some of our conversation, last time did talk about how the technical intervention that's needed for P2 reserves are becoming less expensive, so they're becoming accessed more than it has in the past. However, for conservativeness, we're recommending that the protocol only credits the P1 reserves, and that to what extent makes sense in the future, we can then consider reevaluating and maybe doing P2 in the future. But at this point, just focusing on crediting those P1 reserves. And I'll just pause here in case there's any disagreement on this proposal. Okay. So from there, who's assessing the economic reserves? So this would be done by the third-party professional petroleum engineering firm. There would have to be a low conflict of interest between all parties involved in the project, as well as the individuals in the engineering firm and the engineering itself. The criteria for demonstrating that there's a low conflict of interest will be outlined in the protocol and would be standardized. At this point, I'm going to recommend that you all take the time to review what those specifics are and that we can follow up with these through written comments, unless there's any, major considerations at this point that anyone wants to bring up. And then they would also have to demonstrate that they're qualified. Again, what, the work history, the certification that's necessary. We can have that conversation about what those qualifications, what the conflict of interest is most appropriate. But however, at this point, just outlining that these would be some of the criteria that would be necessary for the third party. Yeah, Jay.
So in the draft protocol that was set out, this was the section, or the section on the demonstrate PPEF is qualified, was the one that was most concerning to me. Because I guess the way the draft was written was that, this information would be provided in an attestation to the verifier. And then, there's a long history kind of with Climate Action Reserve in terms of, relative to these attestations, what the verifier needs to check versus what is covered by the attestation. And so I guess I would just really urge that, those qualifications, anything that the verifier would need to be checked, that the verifier would need to check would be objective, because this kind of, confirming that someone is qualified can be very, very challenging for a verifier. And, it gets into a lot of professional judgment in terms of, things like the work history and reviewing the resumes and things like that, where, you need to say, okay, do I think this person is qualified? And, like I said, I would just really encourage these qualifications to be, if they're going to be checked by the verifier, to be objective. Again, we've seen this in other protocols, and it's really difficult sometimes to execute professional judgment on someone's qualifications. And this was also, I think, an issue that had come up under the ACR protocol. It's a different thing, but it was the measurement. There was a measurement expert, which ACR said initially they would determine whether they were qualified. Then they kind of bounced it back to the verifier, and again, it was one of those things where it was problematic in that protocol. I would hope that we could avoid it being problematic in this protocol. Thank you.
Reed?
So this is a really good point, Jay. The way that the draft protocol is currently written, it's so scope limited on how many petroleum engineering firms are applicable. You're talking maybe 10, 15 firms within the US. We did it that way because it's so difficult to go through the qualifications of any one individual and try and confirm those objectively. There were enough things, but to try and limit, the real piece was independence. We've got very large operators, and we want to make sure that they're not making up 30% of the revenue attributed to that petroleum engineering firm. So we scope limited the amount of firms that would actually be applicable to such a small count that I think it might be possible to pre-list all of the approved PPEFs at some point on the methodology, or have a constantly updated list of approved petroleum engineers so that you wouldn't have to be making that judgment call.
Dan?
So I get where you're going with that, Reed, and I can't argue with trying to limit that. I think Jay has a good comment, a good point in that. I can think of way more than 10 companies that would meet those qualifications, and I see what you're saying, and that's your view. I just wholeheartedly disagree. So anyway.
Jay, did you have other comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that and what Reed said, which is that if I know it's a little bit different than what CAR has done in the past, but if there is a possibility of having, I think, what's called a positive list in terms of these engineering firms, where again the reserve would the reserve could pre-screen those, or there could be some process that it will be clear these are the firms who are qualified to do that. I think that would greatly simplify. It could potentially simplify the process. And again, I have real concerns about that evaluation. I hear what Dan's saying, but again, I think it would be great to have a positive list to limit professional judgment at the verification level.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have CAR approve those firms to go through and decide who they're going to allow in that respect? And for that matter, are we going to approve verifiers under the same sort of thing? I don't know. It just gets complex.
So we do have an approval process for verification bodies. We rely on the accreditation bodies. So and then we will do our own internal training within the different verification bodies that have that ANSI accreditation or ANAB. And then, yeah, we do our own training so that even under this protocol, we would have verification bodies and verifiers come to us, then we would train them on the specifics of the protocol. So that's something that we already do. We just haven't extended it beyond verification. So we can have that conversation internally to see, what we can do to, increase the objectiveness of the qualifications and the conflict of interest assessment, and then provide very specific guidance for the verification body to try to limit limit the amount of judgment that you have to apply, or provide as much guidance as we can around that. And then to what extent makes sense internally, we can have those conversations of what type of, list or more standardized information that we could provide. Paneet?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think a positive list is good. I'd like to know, with those who've had experience with that, what's the typical lead time, and would restricting the lists put, put restrictions on the project timeline and possibly affect the eligibility criteria. And then secondly, and this might be better posed for the next meeting, but what is the typical variability and uncertainty in the P1 and P2 assessments, and how would that uncertainty get carried over into the methodology?
To your first point, I think that that's something that we can consider when we internally have a chance to discuss, whether we want to go down that positive list route. And if we can, we'll definitely consider how long it would take to go through that process so we don't, hinder a project's ability to complete the verification process. In terms of the reserves, we have an extra, or on a future slide, we do talk about like how they're doing the analysis. So there's, built in, um, I guess, confidence intervals and like percent error that would go within that. But generally speaking, like the P1 reserves would be the quantity of reserves that would be 90% probable of being it was like commercially extractable or like economic. Um, and this petroleum resources management system, as well as the supporting application guidelines, do provide a lot of details around, how these analyses are being conducted, as well as the different, uncertainty calculations that would be included within that. So that's something that we can discuss further as well.
Okay.
Yeah, Dan?
So I just want to throw one thing out as we look at this, trying to limit the list and whatnot. What we don't note and what I think should be considered, and I talked about this a little bit before, but I've seen a lot of this work being done, this reserve analysis work being done by, let's say, a petroleum engineer that is licensed in Texas that's doing reserve analysis in another state where they're not even licensed to practice engineering. And the thing to keep in mind is that as a petroleum engineer, if you're going to practice engineering outside of that, you need to be a registered professional engineer to do that. So we should be requiring this stuff to be signed and sealed by a professional engineer in the state where the project is being done. And because we're worried about some of these details, so if that registered professional petroleum engineer puts his seal on something and he does a poor job, he can lose his license to ever do this again. So I'm just saying, that's like, if we want to build a bridge or any number of things for a city or a state or whatever, you have to do that if you're going to be doing that. And it seems like that, to me, that makes sense for us to do here. And that has somebody whose license is then on the line to assure that they're doing things above board and in relation to industry standards and all that. So just my 2 cents.
No, I think all of what you're saying makes sense. We do have, let's say, like on the forest side, I don't work too much in that area, but I do know for like compliance, for instance, they do have to be a professional forester within the state. So we can add some clarification about being the professional engineer in the state for which the project is located, as well as instead of just having at least one person on the team with that certification, it should be, signed or, whatever appropriate language makes sense by that engineer. Wes, did you want to add anything? Okay. Any other comments related to the engineering firm? Okay. And then just some clarifying some of the timelines and additional guidance. Wanting to standardize more of, all the information that should be included within the report and how the analysis is done. So the report should follow the guidelines in the most recent Petroleum Resource Management System, the PRMS, and the application guidelines. to one of our conversations that we had discussed earlier around the, production. So we added some language that no production may occur from the contract effective date with that engineering firm until the date that the well is plugged, or the reserves must be reevaluated. So we had chosen that contract effective date language, essentially just like making sure that when they're analyzing the data, that it is, once they start their analysis, there's no changes. And then also requiring that the well should be plugged within 12 months of that report being completed, or again, the reserves should be reevaluated. I put the 12 months in red because I wanted to make sure that 12 months would be a sufficient amount of time. Um, should it be 18 months? Should it be 24 months? We want to make sure that there's enough time for them to actually go through the plugging and abandonment steps, but also just ensure that everything is done within a timely manner and the reserves haven't changed. So I'll pause here if there's any initial comments, but again, we can always follow up with written feedback as well. Reed, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I understand. So the project wells get analyzed. They determine the amount of 1P reserves that would go on in a business as usual case to be produced. Let's say plugging is set for a month later and those wells continue to produce for that month. Are you saying that at the date they plug, they need to do an update to the reserve report?
No. So what I'm saying is, really just wanting to make sure that all that the report is up to date and that all of the analysis of the reserves is up to date, and that the project kind of goes through these milestones in a relatively timely manner. Since the production would stop at the date that they begin analyzing, or like the contract effective date, so the date that they begin their analysis, um, ensuring that another requirement to ensure that production um, has stopped and that the reserves at the time of the plugging are an accurate reflection of what the reserves would be at that point, and that they didn't continue to extract while the reserves are being evaluated, or after the report has been completed and they're done their analysis, that they don't then continue to extract.
In most cases, the reserve report would be completed and the well would continue to produce for some period of time and then be plugged. And so in practice, or at least what the methodology currently says, is that you would take the amount produced in between when the reserve report was completed and when the wells were taken off production, and you would subtract that from the reserves because they ended up being produced, if that makes sense. I Currently, you're saying the reserves as of Jan 1 are X barrels. If the well produces until Feb 1, then you would take out any production that happened in between January and February from that number as something that you can credit. But again, happy to get creative with you on language. But I don't know. I don't think we'll run into scenarios in practice in which the well stops producing at the time in which the reserve report is done. I think the reserve report will almost always be before the well stops producing.
Okay. So, I mean, that's in the business as usual scenario, but in the case of the protocol, wouldn't we want them to ensure that production had ceased when the report is being, or when all the reserves are being evaluated, rather than by taking a deduction after the fact? Wouldn't there be a risk of like gaming, I guess, with that, of not, I don't know, not providing all of the information related to the production?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be a huge prohibitive piece to run the reserve report when you're plugging the well or after you've taken the well off production. I don't know that that'll cause a ton of problems. However, I don't see a huge issue with, like, they're incentivized to keep oil and gas in the ground. That's how they create a carbon credit. So they're going to begin to limit production as much as possible from the time in which they've decided to plug the wells. But But if we need to run a new updated reserve report on the day when they take the well off production, I'm sure we can do that. I'll just need to speak with the petroleum engineers in the room who know whether or not that causes complication.
How long does it usually take for, like in your experience, for the engineers to do the evaluation and complete the report?
Almost always they'll have a reserve report that was done previously. Let's say it's a couple of years ago, and then they will update that report in a period of a week or two.
Okay.
That's what I was going to say is, as you're doing that for the ones we do, once you do the reserve report now where that could vary from that, Reed, is that if the anticipated production is vastly different, so there could be, like somebody said earlier, some outliers, but generally if you're doing that and it aligns with what you've assumed, this is easy peasy, really.
Okay.
Rachel, just making sure I understand. It seems like the two proposals are, one is to do a reserve report within 12 months of when you plug the well and reduce the amount of reserves you're creating a credit for by the amount produced in between the reserve report date and the date it was taken off production. And the other idea is to get a brand new updated reserve report at or after the time in which it was plugged. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I guess the original intention, or like what I had assumed when drafting this, was that when they start doing the analysis, like to generate the economic, or, the report for the economic reserves, that it was normal. I guess maybe it wouldn't be normal during business as usual, because there was, they would want to continue to get the reserves until they're plugging. But my assumption was that they would stop production entirely. But if they chose not to, then they would have to redo the report. So the thought was that projects would stop producing for the entirety of that time, not the expectation of like they would just need to, make changes again. I didn't believe that they would continue the extraction, that they would just stop.
So in order to analyze a well's carbon credit potential, we've got to have a reserve report from the very beginning, or at least an understanding of the reserves. So that's just to evaluate what it's going to be worth. Then they make the choice that they're going to plug the well early. And at that point, they're going to take that well off production. So typically we would just take whatever was produced in between those two dates out of the reserve report. However, I don't think it would be prohibitively difficult to get an updated reserve report done at the date when they plug the well. However, if they're plugging 50 wells and they're doing one every 2 weeks, and you got to do a new reserve report every 2 weeks for every single plug, that does create some complexity. So I think my advocacy would be that we reduce the amount of sequestered reserves by publicly available production data at the time in which the wells are plugged. But that's just what the current protocol says. So very open to discussion on that.
Okay, thank you. Heather? Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. I was eating off camera. I think we agree with what Reed is saying, that you do the reserve report and that isn't the trigger to do the P&A activity or to cease production, and that there is some internal advocacy of what the value of the carbon credits are and kind of building the business case and finalizing the decision internally. And I do think that would support additionality as well.
Okay. Okay.
But happy to provide written comments on that. But from an operator's perspective, I think that would be our preference.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's really good to know. So we can review that and, make some changes as necessary. Great. Then the next is the how piece. So we pulled these, the three different modeling methods from the Petroleum Resources Management System. So there is the analogy method, which would estimate the reserves by comparing a newly discovered or poorly defined reservoir to be compared to a similar known reservoir. I did, grade this one out and, recommending that it's not eligible for use since um, my understanding is that, wouldn't be conservative, especially compared to some of the other options that are available. So then there's also the volumetric estimate, which would use reservoir, rock, and fluid properties to calculate the total uh, petroleum initially in place, then would estimate the portion that could be recovered. There's the, two different approaches within that. The probabilistic approach, which would be used in the early stages when data is not, or when data is limited. So in that case, like that one just wouldn't be applicable to marginal wells. But then there's also the deterministic approach, which can be applied for, wells in their later stages of life, which would be applicable to marginal wells. And then the other one is the performance-based estimate, which would include, two sub-methods for the material balance method, which would be an analysis of pressure behavior as the fluids are withdrawn, and then the production performance analysis or the decline curve analysis, which would estimate the reserves by changing the rate in production and production fluid ratios versus time and cumulative production as reservoir fluids are withdrawn. I can come back to the slide, but basically, just proposing some considerations here. So, given those different modeling approaches, to ensure that there's consistent evaluation and that everything is appropriate, should the protocol require a specific approach for all projects, or would the approach vary by project? Or should the engineering firm be allowed to determine what's appropriate? The guidelines, the PRMS guidelines, says that the confidence of the assessment results would increase when the estimates are supported by more than one analytical procedure. So should they do multiple? And then also just generally, are there other modeling approaches that should be used or, other other feedback or just general comments to this? And I can go back to this other slide as well. Read.
I worry a little bit about the risk taken on by Climate Action Reserve when they begin to stipulate on how the reserve should be analyzed. I think if the reserves engineering firm passes the positive list and all the quality parameters, then they certify the reserve report, placing their name on the line to validate these reserves are 90+% likely to occur. They almost always are going to take as many techniques as they can in order to ensure a high quality estimate, but certain basins or geologic formations may require, different use at different times. So I tend to think if they're a super high quality group, that should be what Climate Action Reserve holds the reserves accountable to, is the quality of the individual or the team conducting them versus any individual method.
Okay. Dan?
So I'll just say in the work that we do for the SEC, and I get they're not an operator, they're not a carbon registry, but they require that we do multiple estimates to be able to see how those vary. So we'd never just do one. I mean, we might do one to like get an idea, but when we're doing something official, you're looking at things from multiple bases. And it seems to me that with what we're talking about, looking at what the SEC does and what they require, as opposed to what you're just doing, say, to raise money for a fund or something like that, the SEC seems to be more like the regulator in the room, and that's what we have to do for them. So I don't know why you wouldn't do the same thing here.
Mm-hmm.
And that aligns exactly with what Reed just said.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's good to know that it's common practice for them to use more. I think Yeah, we don't want to be like overly prescriptive in the protocol, but to what extent we can standardize certain conditions, and we definitely opt to go that route. But if it doesn't make sense for these, then we're open to that. Yeah, Arjun?
Just a question. I mean, for those more knowledgeable about this, would it make sense to require that the assessment use more than one method, regardless of what the choice of methods is, to come to their conclusion?
So I'll just say this is that it's hard to say that because sometimes on some of the things we've done, we said, okay, we're looking at this, but this one has insufficient data for what we're doing, so we might look at multiple methods and choose what is most appropriate based on availability of data and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to require necessarily. So I think it aligns a lot with what Reed was saying. And what I'm saying is that you really have to rely on the expertise of that engineer and engineering firm and his team, his or her team, I guess, but in what they're doing and to be able to say that. But I see no reason why they couldn't say we looked at these three methods, and two of them we had insufficient data, and this one had more, and this is what we're relying on. And even the ones without the sufficient data, you know, generally they'll be supportive of that. You just can't really fully rely on them because they're for whatever reason, you know. I don't know if that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Maybe the language is where sufficient data is available. These things have to be pursued, at least two of these
I like
methods.
that. Yeah.
However you'd like to phrase it.
I actually believe 3:30 that we're at time here. So
Yeah,
I
I've
will,
got to run.
yeah, sorry about that. I will jump to the end and we'll just quickly talk about, next steps. So we have our fourth work group meeting scheduled for March 3rd. Please provide a written comment related to what we've talked about thus far. And then we'll follow up with you all related to the next steps for what to expect for the next work group meeting, as well as any, supporting information, supporting documentation for that. And then we will also publish the recording and the presentation documents online. With that, you all should have my email already, but here's mine and John's contact information. Well, and with that, thank you all for a great discussion today. We'll follow up with you all shortly.
Thanks,